Well, in this capacity building step number 2, we're going to talk about 4 resources from the Father, and we're going to continue with that focus on Jesus because it's very fascinating to see the beginning of Christ's ministry. When he starts, he's baptized by John, and something happens during that baptism. The Spirit of God descends on him. As soon as he was baptized, he went up out of the water. Suddenly the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and resting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." So what you see here is the Father giving him resources for the ministry that's ahead. This is one of the 3 times in Scripture where you actually overhear the Father talking to the Son. So it's very significant what he says. This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Now, if you go to another time where the Spirit, not where a voice comes from heaven, it's at the Mount of Transfiguration, much later in Christ's ministry, just about before he's going to turn and head towards Jerusalem and his crucifixion. They're up there, he's transformed, and then Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, it's good that we're here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And then, while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Now, isn't that interesting that this is the second time we overhear the Father talking to the Son, and he basically tells him the same thing, even though it's at a different spot in his ministry, but the words from the Father are the same. Now, if you watch the relationship between a father and son and only heard a couple conversations, but the same thing was said, you might say, well, that must be the content of a lot of their conversations. I actually believe that these 2 phrases summarize and put together in very compact form the heart of the Father for his Son and the heart of the Father for us. The resources that the Father was giving Jesus and the resources that he gives us that actually allow us to be successful in ministry. Resources that we desperately need for the work he's called us to. And here they are. He says, "This is my son. This is my son. This is my daughter," for you women leaders. Identity, to be a son means that you belong. To be a son means that you have, your life has meaning, that you're defined by this relationship, identity. This is my son whom I love. He expresses his heart of love, his father heart of love for his son, with whom I'm well pleased, pleasure. And then in Matthew 17, he says, listen to him. And remember that Peter, right before there, had said he was going to build 3 tents, one for Moses, one for Elijah, one for Jesus. He was saying, Jesus, that's your place over there. You belong in that tent. And the Father basically says, no, you don't push around my son. You listen to him. I define and I defend my son's place. And I believe this last thing is this issue of place. And I also believe that these 4 needs are deep needs of our soul, deep needs of everyone's soul. Just think how much people fight to find themselves. Who am I? Or to get love, to experience pleasure. I want likes on Facebook or the applause of others, or to know that you're pleased, to know that people don't not just love me, but they like me, pleasure, and place, that there's a place for me, that I belong on this team, or I belong in this church, or I belong in this, and not only that, but that place is unique, it's mine. It's interesting when Jesus said he was going to prepare a place for us. In John, he said that there's a place in my Father's mansion. Our destination in heaven has places that are individually designed. It's not just going to be some big dorm room, but you're going to have a room that belongs to you. And these 4 resources from the Father actually are crucial for your leadership, and they're also crucial that other people experience through you. So if you don't have identity, love, pleasure, and place, you'll be trying to get that from every one of your engagements. You'll be trying to figure out who you are. You'll be trying to get love from the people that you lead. You'll be seeking their approval in ways that distort what you do. You'll be fighting for a place, competing with others, elbowing them aside. So you need these resources from the Father for you to stand firm in leadership. But the other thing is that all those you lead need to feel these father streams through you. So some of you might say, well, how can a father stream come through, say, a woman or someone who's younger? And I believe the father heart of God is meant to be channeled through us to others, even though it will be channeled in different keys. So you can have the father heart of God channeled in the key of mother, or channeled in the key of brother, or channeled in the key of sister. But it's a reflection of God's father heart that we pass on. And when we're fueled by the father heart of God and passing on the resources of the father heart of God, it's like it's the oil that makes leadership work. It gives us the fuel, that oil that fuels us, but also it makes everything we do, it's kind of the music behind the message, because the people around us are going to be constantly having these needs too, and our presence will energize and fill them. Often leadership doesn't work because we're deficient in one of these areas, identity, love, pleasure, and place, or we're poor at passing those on. Now, it's interesting to go into the life of Christ into John 5 and see a spot. By the way, John 5 is one of the places in the Bible where we see the word Father related to God as Father more often than any others. The chapter where it's the most often is in John 14. The second most often is in John 5. And this is a fascinating story because Jesus heals someone who has been born blind. So he was an invalid. Sorry, I got the wrong one. And he was an invalid who'd been laying there for a long time, for 38 years at this pool of Bethesda. And Jesus said, pick up your bed and walk. But he did it on the wrong day. He did it on the Sabbath. And so you'll find later on, the man is confronted by the Pharisees. They're saying, why are you carrying your mat? And he says, well, the man who healed me told me to do it. And they said, who was it? And he didn't know. But later on, we pick up the story in verse 14. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who healed him. This is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. So Jesus is under great pressure. He's leading, but people are pushing against him. They don't like what he's doing. In fact, they're persecuting him. And look at his response. This is really interesting. He says, my Father is working until now, and I too am working. He actually, for stability, reaches into his identity that he belongs to his Father, and he says, my Father works, so I work. I do the things that he does. I belong to him. My Father is working, and now I am working. And the Jews in verse 18, they were really mad. This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, not only because he was breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. They're basically saying, you can't do that. You can't be that good. What's interesting is that identity gives value. If he is the Son of God, well, then he naturally has value, even if he doesn't have position, even if he doesn't have a special ring or a special stamp. He is the Son of God. This gives value, and they're basically saying, you can't have that much value. Identity gives value. And value is so important for you to have and to be passing on to others. In fact, often, in the midst of whatever you're leading, people are asking the question, am I valuable? Who am I? Am I valuable? Do I have to be just like you to be significant? And you'll see in your notes, I've got some other things here. Without identity from the Father, you'll be defined by people and circumstances around you. This will be constantly changing and unstable. You'll be very vulnerable to your environment and not have a clear sense of self. You'll constantly need to prove yourself or defend yourself. And this distorts leadership. Do you know leaders that when someone criticizes them, they take it very personally? It's like, you're attacking my identity. Leaders who can't look at their failures or weaknesses because they feel like then they'll become nobody. Leaders who are constantly trying to prove themselves. Leaders who are competing because they think if someone is better than them, then they're no one. Wow. And then you know leaders who have such a clear sense of who they are and who they belong to that they never ask those questions. And that changes all of their leadership. what would happen to your leadership if it's missing for you? And we were just talking about how that'll distort. You'll be answering identity issues as you go about leading, and it will distort the way you lead. And what will happen to your leadership if you fail to pass it on to others? So as you're leading your church or leading your organization, as you're leading your Bible study, as you're leading your family, the people around you are constantly asking identity questions. Who am I, and am I valuable? And if you can't, through the different things, through the way you thank them, through the way you look at them, through the way you correct them, through the way you direct them, if all of those steps don't carry this value that comes because of who they are and who they belong to, they're going to feel it. And they might be fighting your feedback because they're fighting identity messages. They may be not wanting to be near you because they feel like they have no value in your presence. So if it's missing for you, you'll be trying to get it in some kind of way. By the way, all of these 4 needs, I believe, are basic needs of the soul. It's like oxygen for our soul. And if we don't have it, we will try to get it in some way. It'd be like if somehow I could take the oxygen out of all of your rooms right now, you would stop listening to me. You would go to the window and try to break it, or else you would fall down unconscious. You wouldn't be able to continue the seminar if you didn't have that basic need of oxygen filled. Everything would stop and you would focus on that. And in the same way, these 4 needs, when they're not met, they tend to trump everything else that's going on, because people in subconscious and sometimes kind of crazy ways are fighting to get them back because they don't have them. Well, Jesus, he just says, I know who I am. The Father's working and I'm working. And then the text goes on. This is really interesting. Verse 19, I hope you're following this in your Bibles as you go. So chapter 5, verse 19, Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees his Father doing. So whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. You see, I know what to do because I just look at my dad. I look at my Father. I do what he does. For the Father loves the Son and shows him what he's doing. Okay, we get into this next thing, this love. It's crazy when, it's one thing when a father says he loves his son. It's another thing when a son says, my Father loves me. So Jesus obviously is convinced of his Father's love. And are you as a leader convinced of your Father's love? Do you go, my Father loves me. My Father loves me. He loves me. And that love is not based on my performance. It's not based on me being perfect. It's not based on me doing lots for him. He loves me because he's a God of love and because I belong to him. And what's interesting is this is what I believe love brings, is love brings security. And you'll find that from the passage, because what are these Pharisees doing? They're threatening to kill Jesus. And he says, I just have to tell you something. I have to tell you my Father loves me. Now, why would someone, as a way of defending himself, talk about his dad loving him? What would happen if someone came up to me, put a gun to my head and said, Dave, I'm going to shoot you, I'm going to kill you. And I say, hey, before you do anything, I just want you to know my dad loves me. That doesn't seem like the kind of response. I would be saying, don't shoot, or I've got a bigger gun than you. How would I defend myself by saying my Father loves me? Unless my father was the chief of police for our town, unless my father was in the next room with a whole bunch of soldiers ready to come in. And I just want you to know my Father loves me. So whatever happens right now, my Father's going to be concerned about it. And he's the kind of father that responds. He's not quiet. He intervenes. He has a lot of capacity. So just so you know, my Father loves me. And you tend to care about the things you love. You tend to defend the things you love. You tend to invest in the things you love. You tend to protect the things you love. Love brings security. The sense of I am loved. Am I loved unconditionally? Am I precious and treasured to someone? Do I matter to anyone? Does anyone care deeply about me? Do I hear and feel your affection and love? And without love, you'll be constantly trying to gain love from those near you. Their love will never be enough, and you'll be chronically disappointed. You may cope by turning off your emotions and being distant and cold. And what does that do for leadership? What will happen to your leadership if you don't know you're loved? Well, you might just become kind of a machine, like emotionless, just tugging through. Or you might say, well, nobody around me needs love. I don't need love. Why would they need love? Or else you'll be leading in a way to get love from people around you, and it will distort them. You'll be thinking, well, if I do this, they'll love me more. If I do this, they'll love me less. We won't be able to make the kinds of decisions we want because we'll be love dependent. We'll be love distorted. We'll be love driven instead of being love filled. And if you don't get filled up with the Father's love before you lead, you won't be able to pass it on. And here's the other thing. And what will happen to your leadership if you fail to pass it on to others? Wow, what's it like when you follow a leader and you know that leader loves you? What's that like? I remember talking to someone who about a really great leader, and they said people would run through walls for him. They'd run through walls for him. And I went, well, why would they do that? Did he pay him a lot? He was actually a businessman. Or did he threaten them often? What was it? And then I spent a little time with this man, and he was so amazing at streaming the Father heart of God. In just a little bit of time, he was saying, hey, Dave, you're really good at this. And I've noticed this in you. Wow, I value that. Wow, that's amazing. And he'd talk about who I was. And then the other thing is I felt his affection. I felt that Father affection from him. And pretty soon I was like, oh, I understand what they're saying. Like, I think I would run through walls for this guy because I know he loves me. And because of that, I kind of, it's like a fire. Like you want to be close to a fire. And leaders who love are like fires. They draw people close to them. And people want to be around them. They want to do things for them because they're being fueled by that love. Now, by the way, don't love just to draw people. That would be manipulative. But if you're flowing with the love of the Father and giving that out to other people, it's like that oil leadership. Everything else tends to work when people are loved, when they feel love through us. And when it's gone, a lot of great leadership techniques won't work. A lot of skills. You can have a very skillful leader, and if you don't feel like that leader loves you, they're just scary. They're just scary. You don't want to follow them. So are you filled with the love of the Father and streaming that to others as you lead? Well, then the passage goes on, and look, we'll actually skip down a little bit later into verse 30, where Jesus says, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I alone bear witness about myself, my testimony is not true. He's saying, I don't seek my will, I seek the will of the one who sent me. And then in 41 through 44, he says, I do not receive glory from people, but I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I've come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his name, you'll receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory? This is this pleasure, like glory, right? From one another, and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God. What he's saying is, I just want to tell you that I really don't care about what the rest of you think. I really care about what my Father thinks. And I'm just seeking his pleasure. I'm seeking the glory that comes from him. And you just see this centering because he's seeking the Father's pleasure, but he's also aware of the Father's pleasure and being fueled by it. I really believe that pleasure brings motivation. He says, I seek it. It brings energy. I'm doing this. I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Often, if your motivation is lacking, it's because you look ahead and you go, oh, failure, or disappointment from others. You may be even looking to God and saying, God's just ready to tell you when you're doing something wrong. And if you do something right, maybe you just won't get hit. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was really gifted in ministry, but just always under pressure, often depressed. And one time I was just trying to help him see himself through God's eyes. And I said, if I would look at you through God's eyes, like what would he say to you? And then he said, almost, but not quite. I said, what do you mean? My question is almost good, but not quite good. He says, no, that's what God would say, almost, but not quite. really? Almost, but not quite? Like you're trying hard, but you didn't quite get it. And then I asked him, have you heard that phrase from anyone else? He says, yeah, I heard it a lot from my dad. And here's one of the tough things when you get into these father resources is that all of us had an earthly father, and he really impacts the way we see God. And often we look up at our Father God through the lens of our earthly dad, and we distort really how the Father views us or expect the same thing. And so he'd look up at God and he'd hear the words of his earthly father saying, almost, but not quite. And that constant disappointment, Dad's never satisfied. Dad always wants more. Dad needs me to get this done because he can't manage by himself. Well, that's not what we see from Scripture. That's not what we see from Jesus. We see that the Father can manage everything on his own, but he invites us into his garden to work with him. And it's a pleasure to work with him. It's a joy to be part of his kingdom. It's a privilege, and that his well done is possible. You see so many times in Scripture, Paul or various people saying, I'm running the race because I want to get the prize. Steward your talents so you can hear him say, well done. So it's that anticipation, that look up and saying, God, you're pleased. I'm doing this for you, that really gives motivation. Well, what will happen to your leadership if it's missing for you? You will, without pleasure from the Father, you'll be addicted to pleasing people and vulnerable to hedonism. Another way that this expresses itself is you'll try to get pleasure somewhere else. Just something that makes you feel good, because it really feels good when someone is pleased with you. But when they're not, sometimes maybe I could just go off and watch 20 hours of Netflix or something and I just feel better. Hedonism. You may cope by avoiding all possibility of failure or rejection. I won't risk so that I don't risk disappointment. I won't try because it's better to not try and not fail. If something goes wrong, I'm devastated. I don't go, oh, I learned a lot. Wow, I'll keep going. My Father's pleased that I'm moving in faith. So if we aren't aware of his pleasure, if we aren't tuned into his Father pleasure, our leadership will be distorted. But here's the other thing. What will happen to your leadership if you fail to pass it on to others? Some leaders are like disappointed dads. You hear from them when something goes wrong, and you never hear from them when something goes right. It's that almost but not quite. It's the grades that you get 6 1s or whatever your scale is, and 1 2, and Dad talks to you about the 2. And some leaders are like that. They're quick to see what's wrong, but they don't stop and say, "That was so great. Oh, it's such a privilege to have you on my team. Wow, I get such joy as I see you grow, as I watch you be who you are." We don't fuel our leadership with the fuel of passing on the Father's pleasure to others. And then people run dry. They have a hard time staying motivated because rather their motivation becomes pain avoidance rather than I'm going to make him proud. I'm going to make my dad proud, first in heaven, but I'm going to make my leader proud because I know my leader walks around, he just gets a smile on his face when he sees what we're doing. Good leaders energize their environment with pleasure from the Father, with joy in who people are and what they're doing. And people love being around that. They'll run through walls for a leader like that. Well, and here's this last place, this place of place. And we can pick this up in verse 21. He says, "For as a father raises the dead and gives them life, so the Son gives life to those whom he will." So it's interesting here. The Father gives life, and he says, "I will entrust some life to my Son." So he takes a piece of what are his responsibilities and gives them to his Son, says, "You can do that too." So it's kind of like a farmer on a tractor who slides over a little bit on the seat and says, "We can drive this together." So he shares something. And good leaders share. They share what's been entrusted with them, to them with others. They don't hoard it to them for themselves. And then it goes on, it says, "For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son." that all may honor the Son as they honor the Father. This is actually delegation. The Father is responsible for judgment, but he delegates it fully to the Son. And good leaders share things. They share the place that's been given them, but they also give over parts of their place to others and say, this is now your place. It's entrusted to you. It's part of something that's bigger than I'm responsible for, but I give this to you. I entrust this to you. And it says that all may honor the Son as they honor the Father, and place brings honor. Place brings honor. That's why people like their name on their desk, or they like their title somewhere. If they have a key spot in an organization, they want everyone to know, because that place brings honor. In the Czech Republic here, if you buy a piece of property, the first thing you do is put a fence around it, because you want to say, this is mine, this is my place, and now I have some honor that this piece of property belongs to me. And one of the things we need to know is that, God owns. I'll tell you a story. My dad, when we were growing up, he grew up on a farm, and he wanted to teach us how to work. So we had a vacant lot next to our house, and he got permission for us to garden it. And so we rototilled this whole piece of property, and then we went out there, and he said, kids, I'm going to give a piece of this garden to each of you. And he marked out with a string the pieces of the garden, and so I chose mine. And then he says, you get to plant whatever you want in it. So my sister planted tomatoes, and my brother planted cucumbers, and I chose to plant popcorn. So maybe you don't even know that it's possible to grow popcorn, but it is. And so we went out there and started planting, and my dad would say, well, here's how you get ready to plant your seeds. And here's how you get your soil ready. Now, what was interesting is he bought the seeds. The soil really didn't belong to me, but I'd been given a place. And when it was done, we stood back and go, you got your popcorn into the ground really well, son. And I had this sense of like honor. That's my popcorn. And as I tended it, I have this sense that there's a place in my Father's garden that actually has been entrusted to me. Well, the tomatoes were harvested soon, and the cucumbers came quickly, and the popcorn was the latest to bring in. I had to be very patient. And then when it was finally picked, you couldn't pop it right away because it's too wet. So you have to take it off the cobs, and then you have to dry it to just the right consistency. And it wasn't until Christmas that we actually could pop my popcorn. But then we had so much popcorn. And whenever we would have visitors, I would say, you want some popcorn? And my dad would say, yeah, you should try some of Dave's popcorn. Dave's popcorn. I have a sense of honor. There's a place. It was my popcorn. Well, it wasn't really my popcorn, but it had been entrusted to me. And God the Father entrusts places of his kingdom to you. They really belong to him, but it's been entrusted to you. And that gives you honor. And you need to know that your work has been given to you by the Father, and not just won by you or because you were better and pushed someone else aside. And if you have that firm sense, then you're not threatened when other people challenge you. You aren't afraid when you run into failure, because you know your Father's going to step in and help you. You know that he's bigger than the storm, or than the fact there's no water this year. That place has been entrusted to you. And so you will stand so much firmer if you have a sense of place, if you know the place has been given you by the Father, which is why we did some of our work just in our last section. And it will be, if it's missing, without place, you'll be constantly fighting to make a place for yourself. You will fear that your life has no significance and be easily threatened by others. You may cope by scaling back your expectations and making a place that is small but defensible. Like when people curl up in a ball, hide behind something, or retreat to a corner, you could be easily distracted. But if you have a clear sense of place, you'll be like Jesus. Hey, he shared this with me. He's entrusted this to me. I know exactly what. And by the way, he says to the Pharisees, you can argue and attack, but I'm still standing firm in what I know my Father's called me to do. And what will happen to your leadership if you fail to pass it on to others? Well, it has real significance. People don't know their place. They don't know that something's been entrusted to them. They don't know that they're trusted. They don't know what's their responsibility and what's someone else's. they don't feel our confidence in them that we're actually giving them a piece of the garden, a place in our bigger place. And sometimes because we don't have our place, we're not confident in giving them their place. Let me give you a couple examples of how this works really practically. By the way, these 4 resources can so deeply affect your leadership. They can create deep leadership deficiencies or create incredible resources for your leadership to be powerful. I remember one time I was leading a group of church planters and people that were working with new churches, and one of our staff members, we'll call him John, was in this group, and he kept throwing in his opinion, and he threw his opinion in at the wrong times, and he often didn't have very good things to say. It was clear that John was kind of fighting for his place, and that the other people in the room were more experienced than him, but he always had an opinion, and it started to really irritate me. And so I said, John, why don't you hold off a little bit on that? Hey, you need to not be saying that. Finally, one time I said, John, why don't you just stop and let other people speak? But in my heart, I'm feeling like John really doesn't know what he's saying. The other people in this room are more experienced. He needs to kind of back off. And I was kind of frustrated that he was kind of fighting to prove himself or something. But my spirit was just, I'm leading this meeting and I'm managing all the inputs and having a hard time managing this input from John. And he came up to me afterwards just really hurt. And, Dave, why did you talk to me like that? And then I was even more irritated. I said, well, I talked to you like that because you just kept talking and you weren't quiet. And I could tell that every time I said something, he just got more hurt. So I stopped talking to him about it. I went home, and that evening I was reflecting on this mini retreat that we'd had, and was telling my wife. She said, how'd it go? I said, it went really well, but I'm a little frustrated with John right now. And I started talking to him about it, and I said, I think I really need to follow up and talk to him more. He just needs to kind of change the way he gives input. And she was quiet. So my wife is usually quite responsive, so she usually, yeah, that's right. Oh, good. I'll be praying for you. It's just quiet. And I said, what do you think? And she said, it's not going to go well. And I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, somebody's got to talk to him about this. He really doesn't know what he's saying, and he's jumping in. And she says, it's not going to go well. My perspective is right. She says, I don't care if your perspective is right or wrong. It's not going to go well. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, your tone is totally wrong, Dave. It's just totally wrong. And she said, I can't figure out what's wrong. And then she said one thing. She said, what if John was your son and you were talking to John as a father, as his father? And I just stopped for a second. I went, well, he's the same age as I am. She said, no, but picture a father's heart towards John. I said, well, if he was my son, I'd probably talk to him this way. I'd say, John, I just really appreciate your involvement in this. And man, I love the way you care about these things. I see that in you. And then I went on to say, here, let me help you give your input in a way that's better. And I can't even remember what I said because it was a little while ago. But she stopped. She said, that was perfect. That'll work. And she said, you have to turn on your father's heart when you lead. If you lead without a father heart, it's going to be, it's like, two pieces of metal pushing against each other. It's going to scratch and damage. But oil is what, oil of the Father's heart is what keeps everything moving. What's interesting is you actually can put quite a bit of pressure on things if it's filled with the Father's heart, and people will thank you. So I did have that conversation with John. I called him up and actually I apologized. I said, John, I'm sorry for my attitude. And excuse me, I'm getting ahead on something here. Just let me go back up. And she said, like I would as a father. And then I shared some things with him. At the end, he said, Dave, thank you so much. Oh, I enjoy working with you. Wow, totally different because of the Father's heart. Now, again, some of you women may be saying, well, I'm a woman. Well, reflect your Father's heart in the key of sister and the key of mother, but bring the Father heart of God to those leadership interactions. They'll be totally different. And since that time, my wife has actually a number of times said, Dave, turn on your father heart. You're leading without a father heart. And so if I'm not passing on the Father heart of God and not receiving the Father heart of God, I actually could maybe even be an abusive leader as I try to get things done without giving people the resources that their heart needs. Another time I was going through just some personal struggle and was having a hard time knowing my place. The ministry had grown, and what was working before it stopped working. I was having to make some adjustments, and I was having a difficult time. What's my place? What's my place? And I started getting horizontal with that, not seeing, looking up. And I remember one conversation with a close coworker. His name is Mel, and I said, Mel, I think I'm just really struggling with place right now. And he said, Dave, you better get that straightened out as soon as possible. And I said, why? He said, well, since you started struggling with place, none of the rest of us know what our place is either. He said, the fact that you're not clear in your place means you can't give it to anyone else. And we're all struggling with place right now because you don't know your place. So these resources of knowing your place from God and then being able to clearly pass that on, the Father's place to other people, is so important and so very valuable. So these 4 resources from the Father, receiving and passing on these 4 resources from the Father gives you leadership empowerment. And by the way, if you want to find out more about these 4 resources, I wrote a book on God as Father and these 4 resources from the Father. And you can pick that up on Amazon or various places. It also exists in the Czech language and the Slovak language, on a whole book on these 4 resources, how to receive and pass them on. Now, I've been telling you about 2 leaders, Unlimited Luke and Transforming Tim. You know, one of the liabilities that Luke has is that Luke's parents divorced when they were young, and he grew up without a father. And this is kind of a deficiency in his life. Now, some of you have that kind of deficiency, but he really grew up fatherless. And he also grew up in a performance environment where who he was very closely tied to what he did. Because of that, he has reacted in kind of the other way. He has a hard time pushing himself and pushing other people, because pushing, kind of stretching, challenging to him is tied with impending disappointment. And so he has a hard time challenging himself, has a hard time challenging others. And it's been difficult for him. His sermons, when he first began preaching, were a lot about kind of a stern God who was telling you what you were doing wrong. And it's taken him a while to be able to preach about God's love. It's a tough thing for him. So his Limited Luke would profit from more rooting in the Father resources of God and more deliberate passing them on. Transforming Tim, if you were around him, this is what you'd feel. He loves his team. He loves his team, and they know it. And he loves them with the Father's love. And he's proud of his kids, his true kids and his spiritual kids, and they feel it. He compliments people often. When I spend time with him, I'm leadership coaching him, but he'll stop and he'll say, Dave, thank you for this. Oh, you made a real difference in my life in this way. I see this in you. Like, he streams the Father heart of God back to me. He's a magnet. People want to be around him. And he's gifted as a leader, but you notice that kind of yellow that's coming out from that picture. He also is kind of like a warm fire because of the fact that he's constantly spreading these resources from the Father. He sees and speaks who people are. So I want you to stop and reflect just for a minute. Evaluate the extent that you experience these resources from the Father on a scale of 1 to 10. And you can quickly go through those: identity, love, pleasure, place, and just say 1 to 10. Do it quickly. Then evaluate the extent that others experience these resources from the Father as you lead on a scale of 1 to 10. And one of the things is to see if you can identify which one is the weakest, and which of these areas would growth in receiving the Father resources make the biggest difference in your own leadership, and in which of these areas would growth in passing on the Father's resource make the biggest difference in what others experience from you as you lead. Now, you could probably reflect on this for a couple hours, and I'm not going to give you that long. So what I'm going to give you, though, is just 1 second. I got to look at my schedule, because we're going to do a break. So you'll have some time to look at your, and when we come back, I'll let you do some questions too, because let me see if we got any questions coming up.